Rome 60 AD. A farmer named Gaius walks through his vineyard at dawn, dragging a copper rod through the soil between the rows. He doesn't know why it works. He only knows his grandfather showed him, and his grandfather's vines were always heavier with fruit than anyone else's on the hillside. His neighbor thinks he's wasting time. His neighbor's harvest that year will fail. Gaius's will not. 2,000 years later, a French engineer named Justin Christofleau published a book showing that copper coiled around a wooden stake, planted in the soil at the edge of a field, could double or even triple crop yields with no fertilizer, no pesticides, no chemicals at all. He traveled across France presenting his results. Farmers wrote him letters. Newspapers covered his experiments. His electric vegetable garden became famous. Then the agrochemical industry got involved, and within a decade, the word electroculture had been quietly removed from encyclopedias. Christofleau's work was classified not for publication. His research was buried, not because it was wrong, but because it was a serious problem for the people selling fertilizer. Today, we are going to talk about a technology that is older than the Roman Empire, that was rediscovered multiple times across centuries, that was systematically suppressed at least once in modern history, and that a growing number of researchers and farmers believe still works today. A copper wire in your field. That's it. The story of how something this simple became forbidden knowledge tells you more about how power actually works than almost any political scandal you've ever read about. Let's start at the beginning. To understand why copper matters to a plant, you first have to understand something that most people never think about. The Earth is not electrically neutral. The ground beneath your feet carries a measurable negative charge. The atmosphere above your head carries a positive one. Between them, there is a continuous flow of natural electrical energy, an invisible current moving through the air, through the soil, through the roots of every plant that has ever grown. Plants are not passive objects that simply absorb water and sunlight. They are bioelectric systems. Their cells communicate through electrical signals. Their roots absorb nutrients partly through electrochemical gradients. The difference in charge between the inside of the root and the mineral-rich soil around it. The difference in electrical potential is what drives nutrients into the plant. This is established biology. This is not fringe theory. What electroculture proposes is simple. If you enhance that electrical environment, if you give the plant's root system a slightly stronger field to work with, you accelerate the whole process. More efficient nutrient absorption, faster growth, better resistance to disease and pests, higher yields, and the material best suited to do this passively with no machinery, no power source, nothing but physics. Copper. Copper is one of the most electrically conductive metals on Earth. When you drive a copper rod into the soil and coil copper wire around it in a spiral pointing upward, you are in essence creating a low-level antenna. It draws atmospheric energy downward. It concentrates it at the root level. It doesn't generate electricity the way a battery does. It channels what is already there. Now, here is the part that makes historians uncomfortable. The Romans knew this, not in those words, not in the language of electromagnetic fields and bioelectric gradients. But the practice? The observation that copper implements in the soil produced better outcomes than iron ones. That is documented, that is traceable, and it goes back further than Rome. The Roman agricultural writers were meticulous men. Cato the Elder, Varro, Columella, Pliny the Elder. These were not poets writing about the romance of farming. They were systematic observers who documented what worked and what didn't with the rigor of engineers. Cato, writing in the 2nd century BC, catalogued the tools required for specific farm sizes down to the individual implement. He noted the quality of different materials. He observed that copper and bronze tools produced different results in the soil than iron ones. He didn't explain why. He simply recorded it, the way good scientists record observations they cannot yet explain. Columella, one of the most important agricultural writers in Roman history, went further. His 12-volume work on farming covered soil preparation, crop rotation, pest management, and the relationship between specific metals and soil fertility in ways that modern readers often dismiss as superstition. But that look very different when you understand electrochemistry. But Columella's observations, as detailed as they were, still didn't explain the mechanism. Nobody did. Not for nearly 2,000 years, until one man died trying to find out. Pliny the Elder, who died with his boots on watching Vesuvius erupt in 79 AD, spent his life compiling the accumulated natural knowledge of the Roman world. In his Natural History, he describes copper compounds applied to vines and grain fields, not just as tools, but as active substances that changed what the soil could do. He was right. We now know that copper is not just electrically conductive, it is also a micronutrient that plants require in small amounts for photosynthesis. Copper-deficient soils produce visibly stunted crops. Copper in the right concentration stimulates plant metabolism at the cellular level, increasing the efficiency of carbon fixation, the core process by which a plant converts sunlight into energy. Copper fertilization in copper-limited soils has been shown, in controlled modern studies, to increase wheat photosynthesis and yield by over 100%. 100%. From a nutrient that was already known to the Romans. But copper's role in ancient agriculture goes beyond the Roman world. It goes back further than that, into the pre-Roman cultures of the Mediterranean and the Near East, and into something that most modern people would find extremely strange to hear described as agricultural technology. Have you ever wondered why ancient cultures went to such extraordinary lengths to build tall, pointed stone structures, not just pyramids, obelisks, stone towers, tall metal-capped pillars positioned at regular intervals across agricultural land, in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in pre-Roman Britain, where enormous stone monoliths were dragged across hundreds of miles and planted in the earth with apparent precision. Mainstream archaeology explains these as religious or astronomical in function, and that interpretation may be entirely correct. Religion and practical function were not separate categories in the ancient world. A structure could be sacred and useful at the same time. But here is what modern researchers in the field of electroculture have observed. Many of these ancient stone structures, when tested with modern instruments, display measurable electromagnetic anomalies. They concentrate the Earth's natural electric field at their bases. Seeds germinated in the proximity of certain standing stones show measurably faster germination rates in controlled experiments. Dr. Phil Callahan, an American researcher who spent decades studying ancient sites and their electromagnetic properties, documented these patterns across cultures. The Irish round towers, tall, narrow stone towers built across medieval Ireland, whose purpose has puzzled historians for centuries, show extremely high levels of paramagnetism. They amplify the Earth's magnetic field at ground level. They were often built in the center of agricultural communities. Were they antennas? Here is what we can say with precision. Callahan measured the towers. The paramagnetism is real. The placement inside agricultural communities is documented, and the tower building tradition in Ireland coincided with periods of notably productive farming in surrounding land, recorded in medieval annals that most historians assumed were exaggeration. They may not have been exaggerating. They may have been reporting, as accurately as they could, what happened when you put a tall paramagnetic structure at the center of your fields. And that observation survived, across cultures, across centuries, across the collapse of Rome, the Dark Ages, the Black Death, the Reformation, until 1920, when someone tried to write it down, patent it, and make it available to every farmer in the world. Justin Christofle was a French engineer and inventor. He was not a mystic. He was not a crank. He held patents in multiple fields. He was respected by his professional peers. In the early years of the 20th century, he became obsessed with a problem: how to grow more food without chemicals. The use of synthetic fertilizers was expanding rapidly across Europe, and Christofle was not convinced that more chemistry was the answer. He began experimenting in his garden with copper wire antennas, spirals of copper wound around wooden stakes, planted at regular intervals in his vegetable beds. His results were extraordinary. His cabbages grew to sizes that drew visitors from neighboring farms. His tomatoes outproduced anything his neighbors were growing. He documented everything. He published, he lectured, He filed patents. In 1920, he formally patented his electroculture antenna system, and his book on the subject became widely read across France and beyond. Farmers were interested. Some tried it. Many reported results consistent with what Christofleau had described. Then the machinery of the agrochemical industry began to move against him. Lobbyists pressured publishers. The term electroculture began to disappear from encyclopedias and agricultural reference books. The research that had been accumulating for a century across multiple countries became suddenly unfindable in mainstream sources. Christofleau himself was not imprisoned. He was not killed. He was simply made invisible. His work was buried under the sheer institutional weight of an industry that had every financial reason to ensure that farmers believed the only path to good yields ran through a bag of synthetic fertilizer. Across the Channel, the British government was conducting its own electroculture experiments between the two world wars, experiments that showed consistently positive results. Those results, too, were marked not for publication. Only 2 copies of each annual report were printed, one for the minister, one for the archive. The British government spent 20 years investigating whether electricity could grow better crops. The results were encouraging enough to continue for 2 decades, and then they were buried. Not because they failed, but because of what would happen to the fertilizer industry if they succeeded. If that makes you angry, if you feel the weight of what it means that a government spent 20 years confirming this worked and then hid the results, hit the like button. Because that reaction you're feeling right now is exactly why this story matters. And we need more people to find it. Let's pause here for a moment. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you already know that the suppression of useful knowledge is not a conspiracy theory. It's a pattern that repeats across history with grinding regularity. The history of science is full of observations that were ahead of their institutional moment. Ideas that worked, that were documented, replicated, observed by competent people, but that threatened existing economic structures and were therefore not allowed to reach the people who needed them most. If you recognize that pattern, if you felt that strange satisfaction of connecting dots that the official version of history leaves unconnected, then this channel exists for you. Subscribe, because we're just getting started. There's something specific about copper, though, that makes this story more than a suppression narrative, something that brings it all the way back to that Roman farmer with his rod in the soil at dawn. Copper is an essential micronutrient for plant health. Copper tools in the soil passively release trace amounts into the surrounding earth. Healthier cell function, better enzyme performance, more efficient photosynthesis. This is not speculative. This is peer-reviewed plant biology. But copper also interacts with the Earth's natural electromagnetic field in ways that modern science is still working to fully characterize. It focuses that field. It creates a different electrical environment around nearby root systems. And plants respond. How much? Studies show that in copper-limited soils, adding copper can more than double wheat yields. In optimal soils, the effect is smaller, but measurable. What is not being argued about is whether something is happening. Something is happening. The question is, why we spent a century pretending it wasn't. The modern revival of electroculture is being driven not by university agriculture departments, though some researchers there are starting to pay attention, but by ordinary farmers and gardeners who tried copper wire antennas in their beds and found that their plants grew differently. Faster, healthier, more resistant to the aphids and fungal diseases that would normally force them to reach for the spray bottle. The science is still catching up. Some soils respond more than others. Some crops show dramatic results, others show none. Anecdote is not data, and that caveat matters. But here is what is not in question: the history. The Romans used copper implements in their vineyards and documented better results. Ancient cultures across the world built paramagnetic stone structures in the center of their agricultural communities. A French engineer in 1920 developed a copper antenna system that doubled his own yields and was then systematically buried by industrial interests. The British government quietly spent 20 years confirming positive results and then classified those results. And now, a century later, people are coiling copper wire around wooden stakes in their gardens and finding Some of them, not all, in some soils and not others, that their plants respond. The thread connecting all of this is not mysticism. It's something simpler and more uncomfortable. The idea that the natural world contains forces and relationships that industrial civilization has very strong financial reasons to pretend don't exist. If a copper wire, something you can buy for a few dollars, can meaningfully improve your harvest, that is a problem for the companies selling you fertilizer. It is a problem for the companies selling you pesticide. It is a problem for every industrial input that becomes unnecessary the moment you work with the Earth's own electrical system instead of trying to replace it with chemistry. This is not a new problem. It is, in fact, an ancient one. Gaius knew it in his vineyard. The builders of the round towers knew it in their fields. Christoflo knew it in his electric garden in France. And the people who suppressed it, in each case, in each era, knew something else. That knowledge which gives people independence from commercial systems is the most threatening knowledge of all. So what do you do with this? If you have a garden, even a small one, you can try this today. Copper wire, a wooden stake. A spiral wound clockwise if you're in the northern hemisphere, counterclockwise in the southern. Push it into the soil near your most important plants. Observe. Document. Share what you find. That's what Christoflo would have told you to do. That's what the Roman farmer was doing 2,000 years before anyone had a word for electromagnetic fields. The experiment has never ended. It was simply interrupted. By lobbying, by classified reports, by the quiet institutional erasure of ideas that made someone else's business model uncomfortable. This is not a story with a clean ending. There is no moment where the truth was officially declared and the industry apologized and the knowledge was restored to its proper place in every agricultural manual. That is not how suppression works. It doesn't end with a confession. It ends with people like you reading, questioning, testing, and finding out for themselves. Now you know the experiment exists. Now you can run it yourself. And if your harvest triples this season, you'll understand from the inside why this has been one of the best kept open secrets in the history of agriculture. What do you think? Is this something you've heard of before, or does this feel completely new to you? Drop your answer in the comments below. I read every single one and I want to know whether electroculture is already in your garden or whether you're hearing this for the first time today. The Romans left us the observation. The medieval Irish left us the towers. The French left us the patent and then buried it. What they couldn't bury was the underlying reality. The earth has always been electrical. Plants have always responded to that electricity. And copper, cheap, ancient, simple copper, has always been one of the best materials for working with that system, rather than fighting against it. If this kind of hidden history is what you're looking for, the stories that official textbooks leave out, the science that got buried before it could change things, then subscribe to this channel, because this is exactly what we do here. Every week, a story that someone, somewhere, would have preferred you never heard. Next week, the Roman food distribution system that fed 1 million people without refrigeration, without trucks and without a single supermarket, and why the method that made it work was quietly abandoned the moment it stopped being profitable. Subscribe so you don't miss it.